10 million followers on Instagram with a whole bunch of bikini pics. But the thing about this is he is all about the honor of it. That's what matters to him the most. And Pestilence betrayed that honor. Pestilence betrayed what they stand for. Honorable combat, having an honorable challenge against somebody else. And so he removes his helmet and she succumbs to his power and literally just disintegrates. And that's the fate that would have awaited Storm, right? There would have been nothing she could have done to stop it. And so in this moment, right, this brief reprieve, that's when you have Cesaia who shows up. And Cesaia gives Storm the Uranos trigger. And she says, here, you take it. You're the one with the authority to make the decision on what we do. I'm tired of listening to this. And that's when Uranos starts talking to Storm. And he says, we meet again, Aurora Monroe. I've been watching your situation, so I won't preamble. It is as I told Cesaia, release me, and within my hour of freedom, I will end your war by ending every single life on this planet that is not of your faction. The trigger is in your hands. The choice is yours. Choose. Now, if she chooses, it would be exactly as Uranos says. He will show up here. Everybody who's not on the side of Storm will die. That's just the way it's going to be. Here's the kicker to this. Ladies and gentlemen, we switch over to the Autumn Lands, once home to the Autumn Palace on Mars. And the Krakoan Gate opens up. And as we know, the Krakoan Gates allow individuals to travel from other dimensions into any other location where a gate is active. A voice simply asks the question, here? And then this person says, dead, lifeless rock, but with a sun caged below it, imprisoned, abandoned, a useful ingredient. And with the storm coming to meet us, for where else can she turn? Yes, here. Here, we will remake the world. Ladies and gentlemen, the real Apocalypse has returned. Not the one that we saw, the projection that we saw in the Immortal X-Men comic that we recently covered. This is the real Apocalypse. And the question's gotta be asked, ladies and gentlemen. What happens, because you know it's gonna happen, what happens when Apocalypse fights Uranos? I can't wait until that comic comes out. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up on X-Men Red, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with X-Men Red, and Fall of X is coming to a close. Now, a lot of you guys expressed a lot of confusion about what was happening in relation to X-Men Red down in the comments section of the last video. So, because this is the final issue, we can kind of recap things. So, one of the things to know is there are three forces at play here, right? There is Storm, then there's Genesis, and then there's Annihilation. And Annihilation isn't somebody that we've really talked about too much outside of the early appearances that Marvel gave us. What we know from the main X-Men comic in issues 13, 14, and 15 is that somewhere along the line in the very early days of Earth, Annihilation emerged as a being, really an elder god of just incredible power. We don't know her origin. We have no idea where she came from. We assume that it was in like the early days of the Elder Gods and Chthon and Demiurge and all that kind of stuff, and she fled to that dimension. But we don't know for certain. We're just kind of left to our own devices to make sense of it. The important thing here is that Annihilation rules over a land called Amenth, which is basically like a really dark world that's out there in some other dimension. But what she does is she controls basically an army of demons. What had happened here is that Amenth somehow managed to get her hands on the Twilight Sword of Surtur. Again, we don't know how. But with using the sword, she literally cut a hole through the fabric of space and time, which allowed her to enter into the earthly plane from the dimension of Amenth, and in doing so, unleash this horde of demonic beings on Earth with the intention of conquering it. Now, of course, again, this is thousands upon thousands of years ago. And while you did have Apocalypse as one of the oldest mutants in existence, along with his wife Genesis and their quote-unquote children, not really biological, but like the four horsemen of Apocalypse, essentially, you also had a whole host of mutants that had come into existence somewhere along the line, and it all kind of been gathered together by Apocalypse himself. But when this invasion took place, one of these mutants, named the White Sword, along with his 100 champions, invaded into the realm of Amenth, and then basically held these demons off as long as they possibly could. Now, the reason White Sword was able to do this, and we'll talk more about that as we get through this video, is that he was able to basically heal himself and his soldiers continually. But for thousands of years, every morning, White Sword would resurrect his soldiers and even himself if he needed to, and then go back out to fight again. But again, they weren't able to hold the demons off forever. What did happen during this time is Annihilation entered into the earthly plane and then actually had a meeting with Genesis herself as a way to basically cease the conflict, right? To end the invasion. But ultimately, none of it worked out, right? It simply didn't happen. We didn't know the reason why that whole meeting just kind of went sour. We ended up learning that Genesis very much believed in the philosophy that only the strong deserve to survive. And so the idea of people waging an endless war as a way of improving themselves was something she very much celebrated. And that actually is what caused the ending of the meeting. She didn't want the fighting to stop. And so eventually Genesis and her forces enter into the realm of Amanth to join the White Sword and his 100 forces, and then the breach is sealed. Apocalypse stays on Earth along with all those mutants that were with him, and that was basically it. And Apocalypse, ever since then, had basically been going through and engaging in his schemes of testing mutants and all that kind of stuff as a way to ensure that when the portal was reopened, Earth's mutant population could enter in, he could rejoin his wife, they could destroy Annihilation, and the day would be saved. Such as it was, with the mutants existing on the island of Okara, when the breach was sealed, Okara was cut in half. The earthly side was Krakoa. The other side that was stuck in the dimension of Amanth became Arakko. And so the result of this is that you basically had Genesis and her forces constantly fighting for thousands upon thousands of years against the forces of Annihilation. Now, the other part of this is Iska, who's not overly important to this part of the story. She's basically done. But the power of Iska is that she will always win no matter what. Her power compels her to join whatever side will inevitably win. The other reason why the whole parlay, the meeting failed, was because Iska allied herself with Annihilation, which was a signal to the forces of Genesis and everybody that there was no conceivable way to win. But maintaining her belief system, she continued fighting anyway. What ended up happening is there came a point when Genesis challenged Annihilation and then ultimately defeated Annihilation. And the result of this is that there was no real leader out there for all the demons that existed. And that's when everybody within Amanth came to the realization it's only a matter of time before these demons, who were leaderless, end up overrunning the entirety of Genesis and the White Sword's forces, find some way into Earth, and then conquer it. And so what Genesis had done is she had donned the helm of Annihilation. And when this happened, the spirit of Annihilation took over Genesis. And that's why we're where we are right now. Because Genesis is basically being controlled by Annihilation herself. And the idea of Genesis was to consolidate all the forces within Amanth under her control. The demons, the White Sword and his champions, her army, the whole 9 yards, and launch an invasion of Earth. Now, as for Arakko, the actual Arakko Mars itself, this was just Mars in Marvel Comics for years, like a red planet, which is just over there, and that was it. But when you got to the Ten of Swords event, which you'll find in the playlist leading up to Fall of X, the whole ending of that was really more just kind of an agreement that was struck between the mutants on Earth, so like the X-Men basically, and those mutants that lived in Amanth. If they wanted to leave and come to the main Marvel Universe, they could. But because of the fact that mutants from Amanth only believed and knew conflict, they couldn't coexist with mutants on Earth, right? Because by all standards of measurement, when you take the life that Genesis and her forces lived versus the life that the X-Men on Earth lived, the X-Men were basically just kicking back with their feet propped up with a Coke and a smile. That's really all it was, right? Their life was very, very cushy because they weren't fighting for survival every single day of their existence. Metaphorically, yes. Physically, no. And so because of that, those mutants that left Amanth and then came to the earthly plane, they took up residence on Mars, and then they renamed Mars to Arakko, and then formed their own governing body. What is it, like the Great Ring, I think is what it was called, which consists of some of the most powerful mutants in existence, right? All of them are Omega level mutants. All that came to a head during Judgment Day. right? Like, it's a whole bunch of stuff that happened. But like during the events of Judgment Day, in effect, the Eternals went to war against the X-Men, and that one of these really old Eternals by the name of Uranos wiped out pretty much all the mutants that resided on Mars slash Arakko. And so what it did is that when Genesis, under the control of Annihilation, left Amenth and made her move to basically attack the main Marvel Universe, Arakko was the first place she went to because it was at the weakest point. There was really no one there protecting it. It was like the equivalent of somebody trying to attack Earth, and most all of Earth's superheroes were destroyed before that person launched their attack. It would be like if Thanos showed up on Earth and wiped out most of the superheroes and then left, and then Galactus was like, I'm gonna consume Earth, right? Like, who's gonna be there to stop it? So that's kind of how things were going on at this particular point in time with regards to Mars and all that. That's how we get here. Storm was originally a kind of in-between for Arakko and like the X-Men on Earth, and became part of the governing body just from trial by conflict and just being amazing, right? Is really all it was. But that's why this conflict is happening the way that it is. Something to understand here as we get into this, right, after ending all this history, if Storm loses this war against Genesis, it's the most important thing. If Storm loses this war against Genesis, everybody on Earth will fall. All the mutants on Earth will fall, because the forces of Genesis and Genesis herself, with the backing of Annihilation's power, dwarfs the ability of most everybody out there in the Marvel Universe with conventional powers. Thor, well, the Sentry's dead. Hulk, all those guys, they will fall against the forces of Amenth and Annihilation, all these demons and mutants and the whole 9 yards. That's why this war is being waged on Arakko. So again, as always, you'll find a link to the playlist at the end of this, but getting into the story itself, what we did as we ended the last video is we had Storm, who showed up, literally manifesting a gigantic island, a gigantic landmass, which she was using to basically engage in a conflict against Genesis, who does the exact same thing, right? She kind of manifests her own gigantic island. Now, the reality here is this is symbolic more than anything else, right? Arakko versus Krakoa, kindness versus evil, like however you want to put it, right? Whatever you want to put it, that's more symbolic. But the fight between Storm and Genesis is anything but. It is a knockdown, drag-out fight. But Storm figures out very, very fast that Genesis is basically dabbling in 3 sources of power. The first is her innate ability, which is to manipulate plant life. Kind of cool, right? Nothing really special going on there. But the other 2 things are the objects she has in her possession. The first is the white sword that literally belonged to White Sword himself. With this sword, she can heal from virtually any injury and any attack, and assuming that it gives her powers comparable to White Sword himself, she can resurrect herself from the dead. And so as long as she has this sword in her possession, there's no real means of defeating her. The other thing is the staff she has, and that's what's channeling the power of Annihilation, and that's what's actually influencing Genesis herself. And so in this fight between the two, the first thing Storm does is she basically whisks the sword away from Genesis, but she does it in like a really, really cool and manipulative fashion. The reason why is because she just starts hammering down lightning onto Genesis herself. But getting into the main fight between Storm and Genesis, it's phenomenal the way this unfolds, right? So like the first thing Genesis does is she literally just uses her power to basically sprout a whole bunch of vines, which immediately seize themselves around Storm. And with anybody else would probably start choking them to death. But Storm, with her power, uses the weather to freeze the vines. And then once they're frozen, breaks free of them, which is just dope. It's so cool to see Storm use her powers in that way. It's one of the things that I love about this is it shows us how Storm uses her abilities in ways that we don't normally get to see. It's small, but it's genius at the same time. Now, what Storm ends up doing is she initially launches a lightning attack to destroy the staff of Genesis. But one of the things that we're told here is that to hear the whisper of Annihilation is to have to obey Annihilation. Now, this is where things get a little finicky here, because what we had known is that when it came to Annihilation's control over the demons from the realm of Amenth, it was just her power to be able to control them. But there wasn't really anything that seemed to indicate that unless a person is in possession of the mask or the staff of Annihilation, kind of both operating as the same thing here, that they could be controlled by Annihilation. What this seems to indicate here is that Annihilation can influence those around her. It's not as intense as it would be if Storm was in possession of the staff, but it is enough that when Storm launches her attack with lightning, Annihilation simply says, miss, and Storm misses the staff. But it's actually kind of a boon here. And the reason why is because when she misses, it does hit the sword, but the sword kind of acts like a lightning rod, right? It's literally made of metal. And so it's not enough to like destroy Genesis, but it is enough to kind of knock her off her guard. And then realizing the capabilities of the sword, Storm whisks it away using her wind, or her ability to control the wind. Now, the thing about the sword is that it's not that dissimilar from the Infinity Stones in terms of how it works. Not in the ability to like manipulate all of reality in some form or fashion, but as we know from like the Illuminati stories, the Infinity Stones want to be together, right? They're always trying to find a way back to each other. The sword itself functions in the exact same way. White Sword is the true owner of the sword. And so when the sword is seemingly whisked away, he can feel it being removed from Genesis. Just like Thor and his hammer, he sticks his hand in the air, recalls the sword, and his powers are right back to him again, right? He's just as capable as he ever was. Now, what this does is it switches over to a fight between White Sword and Jon Ironfire. It's not the most significant part of this story, but it is kind of cool because it does allow us to focus on why I would argue White Sword is probably one of the most powerful mutants to ever exist in Marvel Comics. The idea behind White Sword and why he's so significant is with the sword that he has and with his inherent mutant power, he can heal from anything. And not only can he heal, he can actually resurrect himself from the dead, which is one of the coolest things, right? That's one of the reasons why White Sword and his 100 champions were able to wage that endless war against Annihilation and her forces in Ameth. Because sure, his soldiers would fall, they would die, but every morning he would resurrect them from the dead and the battle would continue once more. So the fact that this guy can never truly die and can even bring himself back makes him a force that's virtually unstoppable. The only caveat to this would be like some reality warper or something crazy like that. But the fight between himself and Jon Ironside is cool because of the fact that Jon and White Sword were a thing at one point, right? A rift was formed between the two of them just based on ideologies. White Sword followed Genesis. Ironside followed Storm. And just based on those ideologies, things just simply didn't work out. But even now, there is a kind of fight, not really to the death, but a very intense battle taking place between the two of them. But what's cool here is that Jon's able to get the upper hand on White Sword just long enough to take his sword from him and cleave him in half. But that's when White Sword says, like, I will heal from this, right? Like, you have to know, there's no way for me to die. And the only way that I will fall is with the defeat of Genesis, right? If she falls, her cause is no longer my own. But as long as she leads my forces and the forces of Annihilation along with her own, I will follow her to whatever end that may be. Now, the next thing we end up doing is actually switching over to the main fight between the forces of Storm and the forces of Genesis. Because remember, they brought their own armies with them. And for the most part, it's a pretty knockdown, drag-out fight. This is a war, a fight among mostly Omega-level mutants. Not all, but most. What's kind of funny about this is that on this battlefield here, the most powerful among them is also the most useless among them, and that is Aura Sarada. Aura Sarada is the one with just like the giant eyeball. The reason why I say this is that as part of the Inner Circle, right, the Great Ring of Arakko, its governing body, Aura Sarada has the ability to wipe people from existence. Literally, she could just like travel through this entire battlefield and just start zapping people, and it'll be like they never existed. The kicker about all this is that can only happen if you recognize the validity of the legal system she represents. So if you see no validity in it, or you choose not to believe in it, her powers are useless against you. So it's a massive caveat against an otherwise astronomically powerful character. And so that's why, despite all her vaunted abilities and the ability to simply just end these conflicts in the blink of an eye, none of it matters, and there's nothing she can do to end this battle. But that's why she's kind of going through saying, all of you have to stop, right? I am the law endures, the law survives all, like all that kind of stuff. But Aura Sarada's lack of power ultimately proves to be her downfall. And the reason why is because Fisher King steps in. Now, here's the cool thing about Fisher King. It's kind of cool, but it sucks at the same time. And the reason why is because Fisher King was a guy that never had any abilities whatsoever. Technically, the people of Arakko, they refer to their powers as weapons, but what he says is that he had no weapon once, and that defined him. And of course, the reason why Fisher King is so significant is because of the fact that in a land of people people, most all of whom have Omega level powers that are fighting every day for their lives, he was a guy with no powers that was still able to maintain his own survival. So is he as powerful as everybody here? No, he has no abilities, but he did earn all their respect. But the thing about this is that at one point, he was bonded with Zelo. Now, Zelo is from Arakko, and it's actually not a singular organism, but more like a giant collection of worms that basically have the ability to like wipe out human bone, right? Or at least to consume any and all substances that they come into contact with. What ends up happening here is that when Fisher King makes his move, that Zelo actually bonds itself directly to Orosorata, and in doing so, consumes Orosorata. It actually eats Orosorata, destroys Orosorata. So like it's just kind of completely and totally dissolved. It'll become important here in a little bit, but at that point, we transition back to Storm. And this is the cool fight between Storm and Genesis, because what goes on here is Storm asks the question, do you see what your war has done, Genesis? Do you see the only way that it can win? With continents torn from the bedrock, whole seas boiled or frozen, with the end of this world. That the argument Storm's making here is, yes, you believe in survival of the fittest. Yes, you believe that only the strong deserve to survive. But what you do not account for is what we as X-Men account for, which is collateral damage. Of what use is being the victor of some great war if there is no land for you to rule anymore or to be in control of anymore, right? Like, congratulations, you are queen of a world that doesn't exist, right? But the response of Genesis is, you say that, you don't do it. You claim to be Omega level, but can you burn both these islands, murder the world that you created? Do you truly have no limit? No, you're not strong enough, but I am the true avatar of life, and life is an endless war, right? So it's just an argument, or really kind of a fight of philosophies, right? Like Thomas Ha, life is short, brutish, and cruel, act accordingly, right? Storm, who's very much not like that and is far more, you could argue, empathetic in terms of her belief system. But it's one of these things where even with Genesis saying that, it's understanding the nature of what it means to be Omega level. They both have the same definition for the most part, right? Having powers with no defined limit, right? That's why Storm is Omega level, because sure, she can control the storms of worlds, but what would happen if Storm could control cosmic storms, right? Storm just traveling from solar system to solar system with the power of a cosmic storm behind her, she would be like a new Galactus, just laying waste to entire sections of the universe in one fell swoop. But with Genesis, it's much the same way. The difference is that being Omega level is not just a definition of your power, it's a definition of your will. How far are you willing to go to ensure that your goal is achieved? And in the case of Genesis, she'll do whatever she has to do. She'll kill whoever she has to kill. It doesn't matter, right? Everybody will fall. So it is a cool moment here, right? A massive difference of philosophies. And she even says, everything that lives fights to survive. Each breath is a battle. Simply to function, your body makes slaves of billions of microscopic fungi. Now, at my command, they turn against you. When the weak do not serve the strong, the body dies. That's what became of Okara in the end. It was the greatest beauty of that ancient world, but it lost, and we lost. The only victory is in survival. The only survival lies in strength. Annihilation called the weak to make way for the strong. Now it serves me, and the call has come again. The humans on Earth are winnowing weaker mutants, not knowing that they are thus dooming themselves to my rule. And the thing about this is that as Storm is literally just kind of laying there, right, bleeding from the mouth, all hope looks like it's effectively lost, right? Storm is about to lose. She seizes control of the Staff of Annihilation. And when that happens, Annihilation speaks directly to her. And this is one of the coolest points of the story, right? It says, you are dying. Your body is turning against you. Your organs fail. One by one, Death, who you have danced with so many times, readies to take you in his arms, but I can offer you a way out, a reprieve. And what Annihilation says is, Genesis was my way into this world. The need in her, the confirmation of her worldview, was a beacon calling me from Ameth. and I was called to that dark world from the lands beyond. But Genesis has outgrown her use. It took far too long the first time to cajole her from her endless prison to further conquest. Given the choice, she will maintain and maintain a siege, maintain her power, maintain a status quo that serves her. And I would grow. And so literally she says, to satisfy that desire, I must at least make the offer. The whole reason for this is because Annihilation, in one, looking at what Storm's capable of in terms of her power, and two, looking at what Storm could achieve and how angry she is, how wrathful she can be. She's almost kind of like this perfect host for Annihilation. Right? Annihilation says, your needs are more noble. You are not motivated as much by personal glory, but I do not concern myself with motivations, only with results. And so it's one of these cool things because Storm ultimately doesn't care. In listening to the words of Annihilation and in paying attention to everything that had happened so far, she realized that Annihilation whispering in her ear to miss, it's why she missed the first time. But Annihilation isn't saying that now. Annihilation is trying to turn Storm to her side, but Storm's will is far too strong. And so in this moment, with the staff in her possession, she calls down the lightning and obliterates it, right? Like we're literally told, Genesis screamed not from the pain, but from the loss, the empty space in her soul where a sweet whisper had lived. Her ancient foe, her oldest friend. Genesis was hardy and could survive the lightning, but the staff in the end was only wood and fragile gold and could not. And so in effect, Storm, in destroying the staff, destroys the essence of Annihilation. It's gone. Storm literally just killed a god. And while you do get a couple people in the aftermath of this in realizing that Genesis has effectively been defeated, that what happens is they stand up and they refuse to accept it. They refuse to bend the knee to Storm and accept Storm as their new ruler. But Ur-Sarada, really more like Zelo-Sarada, if you want to call her that, kind of arrives on the scene. And with the power at their disposal and Storm being the rightful ruler, Zelo, in control of Ur-Sarada, recognizes Storm as the legitimate winner because all laws in Arakko are determined in trial by combat. Storm defeated Genesis. Storm is now the ruler. That is the law of the land. Therefore, those individuals who believe in Iraqi law but refuse to believe that Storm is the winner are now subject to the power of Ur-Sarada. And she starts annihilating them from existence. And even says, like, is there anybody else out there who would defy me for a broken mask? And every single one of them bends the knee. They accept the fact that